Okay, well, good afternoon, everyone. It's lovely to see so many people here again this afternoon, both Belfast Summer School students and guests. You're all very welcome. Oh, very welcome to this third online Belfast Summer School lecture. And today I'm delighted to introduce to you Maiken Mosleth King. And Maiken is our current Egyptian hieroglyphs tutor. So she's going above and beyond today, and she's going to talk to us. So Maiken is a lecturer in ancient history at the University of Bristol. She's finishing off her PhD thesis on funerary stele and identity in Roman Egypt. She has a bachelor's degree and a master's degree in Egyptology from the University of Liverpool. And she's currently working on a book on the reception of Tutankhamun between 1922 and 2022. So I'm just going to hand over to Maiken. She's going to tell us today about video games, ancient Egyptian, the representation of ancient Egypt in video games. Maiken, over to you.
Thank you. So for me, this is an opportunity to talk about one of my big research interests, which is reception studies. So how the ancient world and ancient Egypt and archaeology, how that's portrayed in modern media, such as books and cinema and games. So in this particular lecture, I'm going to be talking about how ancient Egypt is portrayed in video games, and I'm going to be using two different games as a bit of a case study. Now, they are made by the same company, it's the same franchise, but both these games actually have pretty different takes on Egypt, and Egypt plays a very different role in each of these narratives. So, as a bit of an introduction, let's see if I can get the next slide up. There we go. So the franchise in question is very famous. It's known for games and also films as well. So it's the Tomb Raider franchise. The first game of that came out in 1996. So since then, there's been a wide range of games. There's also been 3 films to date, and there's an animated series coming out fairly soon. So this is a pretty big, very big franchise, very famous franchise. And arguably, this type of franchise, like Tomb Raider, it sort of draws on a lot of conventions of archaeology that we see in cinema, like Indiana Jones. So there are some of the same kind of concepts and ideas operating in these games as you see in Indiana Jones. So in the very first game, which came out in 1996, now, this game also has a remake, so the remake has the same story, the same concept. So the remake came out in 2007. So the original game and its remake, they are very similar. So they feature Egypt in their storyline, as does the 4th game of the franchise, which came out in 1999, and the title of that game is the Last Revelation. And each of these games use Egyptian imagery, and they use some sort of Egyptian setting, but in very different ways. So, for example, in the first game, and by extension, its remake, in the first game, it's very centered on Atlantis. So Egypt in this storyline is being incorporated into a narrative about Atlantis, whereas the other game, The Last Revelation, it's not centered on Atlantis. It instead focuses on it's drawn from the Egyptian myth of Horus and Seth. So the very first game, you can see a screenshot here from the remake, the one that came out in 2007. You can see that there's some very distinct Egyptian imagery going on here. We can pretty much recognize straight away. We can recognize this big pointy thing, which is an obelisk. You also see as well, there is a big sphinx, so that's also very easily recognizable as Egyptian imagery. And we also have some kind of Egyptian temple structure, and we even have a bit of royal imagery on this door here on the left. So all of these images are very visible, easily recognizable icons of ancient Egypt. So the difference between these two games. is that in the first game, we have a fictional Egyptian location, whereas the second game, The Last Revelation, actually uses a range of real-life locations in Egypt. So in the first game, because it draws so much on this Atlantis concept, it works better in the context of the storyline to have this fictional place in Egypt. But from an audience perspective, we step into this fictional place and we straight away know that we are in Egypt because of this distinct Egyptian, almost stereotypical Egyptian imagery. So that is very apparent to the audience straight away. So let's think about the very first game. The very first game, and again by extension, it's remake. We have this artifact which is quite central to the story, and this artifact is known as the Scion. So we follow the protagonist, whose name is Lara Croft. Again, very famous heroine in the franchise. And this Scion, and you can see a picture of it here. So it's got some sort of mysterious writing on it. It looks very strange, very mechanical. It's quite a mysterious object. So the whole premise here is that this object has been divided into 3 pieces, and Lara is seeking the 3 different pieces so they can be reunited and reassembled. And the 3 pieces are hidden in different places. So the very first one is divided in Peru, quite specifically. It's been hidden in Vilcabamba, which is the final hiding place of the Inca dynasty. The second piece has been divided or hidden in Greece. So it's some sort of mysterious mountaintop in Greece. Again, it is basically a fictional location in Greece as well. There's even a Colosseum there, which is a bit random. But again, for the purpose of the audience, it needs to be made clear to the audience that they are somewhere in Greece. And I think for a lot of people, they think of theaters and Colosseum as being a very Greco-Roman thing. So you need this instant recognizable imagery. And the third piece is in Egypt. So that's what I'm focusing on here. So Lara is the protagonist who is looking for these mysterious pieces. And she's commissioned to do so by this mysterious woman called Natla. And it becomes clear over the course of the storyline, over the course of the narrative, we eventually learn that the Scion is actually not a human or a man-made object. It is in fact an Atlantean object. And then it also becomes apparent that not only is the Scion an Atlantean type of artifact, but that Natla herself, who has commissioned Lara to find these pieces, that Natla herself is actually an Atlantean, and she's an ancient Atlantean queen. And so it becomes apparent that she is seeking to take all of these pieces, to reassemble them, reunite them, so that she can return Atlantis to some sort of former glory. And of course, because Lara is the protagonist, we can't have a protagonist who's a bad guy, right? So the protagonist has to be the hero. So therefore, it becomes Lara's job to track down Natla and in her hiding place of Atlantis and stop her from carrying out this evil plan. So that is the storyline in a nutshell. So Atlantis features here very, very heavily. So there is this implication. So like I said, we have the 3 pieces in Peru and Greece and Egypt. Now, these are 3 cultures that, I mean, we're talking about quite disparate time periods. So for example, classical Greece, or the sort of Greek culture as we tend to think of it, originated about 800 BC approximately. And I mean, I'm not including Mycenaean Greece in that, but I'm talking about the kind of more classical style of Greek culture. So that's about 800 BC. Egypt, of course, state formation in Egypt goes back to about 3200 BC. So that's a much older state. Whereas the Incas in Peru, I mean, we're talking about the 15th century AD. So, so that is a very, very different time period. But in the context of this game, all of these cultures are seen as having some kind of connection to Atlantis. And they have all been somehow influenced in some way by the Atlantean culture and the Atlantean rulers and technology. So that is the very underlying idea that we find here. So this is not really unique to this particular game. We do see Atlantis featuring in other types of media, so this concept wasn't invented by the game, but the game is drawing very heavily on this notion of Egypt and the ancient Greeks and the Incas as having some sort of influence from Atlantis. And if we look at go to the next slide. I will talk a little bit about the fictional Egyptian location that we see in this first game. So again, you can see another screenshot, again, very easily recognizable Egyptian imagery. We have the obelisk and the sphinx and the sort of temple structure. So very easily, very distinct Egypt. But the place itself is entirely fictional, invented by the game developers. And this place is referred to in the game as Khamun. And it's shown as being basically quite a remote location. It's shown being kind of rock cut, so cut into the rocks, and it's fairly remote. So it's in some sort of desert location. So it's a bit of a remote, mysterious place. It looks a little bit like the Valley of the Kings, but it's not meant to be set in the real life Valley of the Kings. It's a very remote place in Egypt. And in the game, Khamun is referred to as a city, but the way it's designed, it seems pretty clear that it's actually not a city in the sense that it had inhabitants, but it seems instead to be a temple housing the Skion. And the other thing we see as well, in addition to these sort of stereotypical images of obelisks and sphinxes, we also see mummies as well. And all of these objects, so mummies, obelisks, and sphinxes, in popular culture, these serve as essentially as icons of ancient Egypt. So they are easily recognizable as Egyptian, even by audiences who are not familiar with ancient Egypt. So it becomes apparent straight away to the audience that we are somewhere in Egypt. And these objects are not really treated as being particularly culturally meaningful in an academic sense. It's more that you tend to find, for example, if you look at the Sphinx here, it has some sort of door in it. So the purpose of this Sphinx is to be a kind of door or entrance to the next section of this area. So there isn't really any way, there isn't really any concern with trying to convey some sort of cultural information. Like the game doesn't tell us why are Sphinxes important in Egyptian culture, what do they mean? And the same with the obelisks. There's no attempt to try to talk about what they mean, culturally speaking. Like, for example, in academic scholarship, it's quite clear that obelisks are symbols of the sun god, and sphinxes are, they are sort of half lion, half human statues, and they represent kingship. So in the Egyptian culture, these are very significant. But in the context of the game, that is overlooked because their purpose isn't to be educational for the audience. The purpose is simply to tell the audience that they are in Egypt through this kind of visual imagery. And one thing we find in this type of action adventure genre of games as well is that the rules of gameplay kind of dictate that objects have to function as some sort of obstacle for the protagonist. Or they have to function as puzzles in some ways, something for the audience or the player to solve. So the purpose here is not to be educational. The purpose here is to provide the protagonist with an environment which facilitates puzzle solving, and also to be this kind of visual reminder that we are in Egypt for the audience. So all of these things are icons of ancient Egypt, very clearly. And we see exactly the same thing going on in cinema. So this is not unique to games, not at all. So again, if we think about this city of Khamun, so you see a couple of screenshots here, you can see that the different objects and the architectural elements, again, they are being used as sort of obstacles in the environment. So that allows the player to come up with different strategies in order to navigate this environment. So the actual, again, the cultural significance of these objects, it's not important. What's important is that they look Egyptian and they act as this kind of obstacle environment for the player. So as Lara progresses through this temple city called Khamun, as she's looking for the Skion, we find that everything becomes increasingly bizarre. So we start to see more and more strange looking monsters that act as enemies for the player to defeat. And some of these are winged monsters that they fly, and they can even attack with some sort of fireball from their mouth. And then some of them are also humanoid felines. So humanoid feline mummies. So they're not actually human mummies. So there is an implication here that these beings, so the winged monsters and these mummies, they are basically of supernatural origin. So they have a supernatural origin, and the audience can infer that they are somehow linked to this Atlantean Skion. So this establishes a link to Atlantis in the minds of the audience. We also see as well that the designers have used real Egyptian iconography. For example, here in both of these two examples, this is real Egyptian iconography, religious iconography. And even we can even date them to quite specific periods, but that's not the purpose of the game. The game is not to date these to any particular period or to use a particular style from a particular period. And the purpose is to simply say to the audience that this is Egypt. And so since we don't really have this attempt to try to date any of this, there is this implication going on that this Khamun is kind of like a timeless and mysterious type of place, and you can't associate it with a particular ruler or a particular time period. And of course, we have the underlying idea that this place is somehow Atlantean. So there is an implication that this place has actually been built by Atlanteans or with some kind of Atlantean technology. So the issue of dating, which is important from an archaeologist perspective, is not important in the game, because what matters here is to establish some sort of mysterious, timeless quality of Egypt. And of course, the Skion itself and also these various monsters, they all serve to create a very clear link between Egypt and Atlantis. So the Egyptian culture is seen as being some kind of result of or a reflection of Atlantis. So if we go to the next slide, let's think about this in a bit more detail. So again, here you can see a screenshot from the game. This is the remake anniversary. I chose that because the resolution of the images is better. So here you can see some of these mummy monsters. You see they're not human looking. They are sort of feline type of monsters. So not human. So the basic premise that underpins this whole game narrative is that the world as our world was once inhabited by people of Atlantis at some point in distant time, distant past, and this realm of Atlantis was governed by humanoid rulers. So there were 3 of them according to this game narrative, and one of them was Natla, the mysterious woman who commissions Lara to find the Skion. The other 2 are known as Tihoken and Qualopec. So these 3 rule together according to this game. And the concept we see here is that these Atlanteans, this Atlantean culture, was very technologically advanced. It provided some kind of blueprint for all later human cultures, and that includes Egypt, Greece, and also Peru as well. So there is this idea that that Atlantis is some sort of origin of all human cultures due to their advanced technology. But like I mentioned, for this premise to work, they have to disregard the archaeological chronology, because according to archaeological chronology, the Egyptian state emerged more than 4,000 years before before the Incas, because the Inca state was founded approximately 1425 AD, and it only lasted a century before the Spanish arrived. So here we're talking about a culture that is both geographically isolated from both Greece and Egypt, but it's also very distant in time from them as well. So from an archaeologist's perspective, there is no reason to try to tie in these cultures as having the same origin. But that is the premise of the game. The game operates on the premise that they have the same origin, and that origin is this sort of humanoid, not quite human Atlantean civilization culture. So when it comes to this idea, this is in the remake anniversary. So this is the remake of the first game. We hear this sound. We hear these spoken words by Lara's father. It's a kind of flashback scene, and he's reading from his diary, and he's talking about his search for Vilcabamba in Peru, where the scion was hidden. So he tells us, or he wrote in his diary, that the relevant bit is that his colleague named Jenkins refuses to accept the possibility that that Atlantis is the foundation on which all known civilizations were built. So that's Lara's father's theory. And then he goes on to say that it's only Lara who is untainted by academic dogma and open-minded enough to see this truth. So this is quite an interesting premise, because there is an idea here that archaeologists who simply refuse to accept this Atlantean chronology, that they are just being somehow stubborn or refusing to see what's really there. And this is a very common driving force in pseudo-archaeology. There is this notion that people who do not accept these pseudo-archaeological, pseudo-scientific theories, that is just because they're stubborn, or at worst, they might even be hiding the truth deliberately. So these kind of notions are very common in pseudo-archaeology. So this is also not unique to the game. The game didn't invent this concept. The game is just drawing on these kind of concepts for the purpose of entertainment primarily. So again, I'm showing you here a screenshot where again you see some very distinct Egyptian imagery going on. We have a big obelisk, and we have some images of kings and gods on the wall. And again, we can actually, these are real images, most of them, that the game has borrowed. And these are the kind of things that archaeologists can actually date quite easily. But in the purpose of the game, or in the context of the game, the dating is not important, because we have to have that timeless quality of Khamun for the narrative to work. So when it comes to Egypt and Atlantis, the notion of Atlantis as some sort of origin point of human culture, that is a fairly old concept. We can trace its emergence in popular culture to a very influential book written by Ignatius Donnelly. So he published a book, a pseudo-scientific work in 1882, and he called it Atlantis, the Antediluvian World. And the whole premise of this book was that Atlantis, as mentioned by, for example, Plato, he saw that as being a very real place, a real culture. He also, like it should be said, Donnelly was not an archaeologist, but he was interested in this kind of stuff. So he was not the most qualified person, I have to say, but he was very keen on the subject. So he interpreted Atlantis as a sort of technologically advanced place where the inhabitants had sent out settlers or created these colonies around the world, and by doing so, they gifted civilization to more primitive people, and of course, Egypt was one of these colonies, and Greece and various places in South America. He saw all of these places as being some sort of Atlantean colony. He was also very devout Christian, so he believed as well that there had been a literal great flood. And so he thought that the Atlantean civilization had been wiped out by the great flood. So essentially, Donnelly's basic premise of Atlantis as some sort of origin, that gets borrowed into this game. But again, I have to specify, this is not the only piece of modern media where this notion occurs. It just happens to be that this is one example of it. So this notion of Atlantis having given rise to other cultures, this is something that there's actually a number of examples of that in popular culture. So that says something about how people like that premise there's something about that premise that appeals to a lot of people. So in the Tomb Raider universe, in this game, we don't have this notion that Atlantis was wiped out by a great flood, as Donnelly suggested. Instead, we see this notion that there was some sort of catastrophe or cataclysm, which seems to have been caused by a conflict between these three rulers. And Natla, who was the queen, wanted to use this Atlantean technology, this advanced technology, in order to basically become the sole ruler. She wanted to usurp the other two, so she wanted to push them out and be the sole ruler. And she also wanted to create some kind of new race, a race of these superior beings, not really humanoids, but like different types of advanced beings. So that seems to have been her plan. And that plan caused some sort of cataclysm, which resulted in the destruction of Atlantis. So in the game, again, this is from the remake, in the game, Lara actually finds one of these remnants of Atlantis because she has to track down Natla. And Natla is hiding inside this great pyramid of Atlantis. So it's sort of pyramid shaped, but as you can see on the inside, it's not particularly Egyptian. It's an Atlantean type of architecture. And you can also see we have the same mysterious script on the wall as well. So the game draws on Donnelly's ideas, but it adapts them and develops them further. And the other thing that becomes apparent as the game progresses as well is that Natla was caught by her co-rulers, Tihokin and Qualapec, and they essentially captured her, and they, as a punishment, they imprisoned her inside some sort of capsule where it looks like time is frozen, and that became buried in the earth, where she remained for thousands and thousands of years. But then she was freed in the 20th century when some sort of building project like dynamite explosion destroyed the capsule. So then she became free, and then she set about trying to find the pieces of the Skion. But then, as it turns out, Lara Croft is the only one who's capable of finding the Skion, because as a kind of hero protagonist, she is the only one who possesses the right kind of skills to do so. So the game ends with Lara going to this great pyramid of Atlantis, which is shown to be located somewhere out in the ocean, and there she defeats Natla in combat, and then the pyramid self-destructs once Natla is dead. So the game ends with the pyramid, Natla and the Skion all destroyed. So the idea is that all of this has to remain hidden from the general public because it's very dangerous. So Lara keeps all of this a secret. It's not something she advertises or publicizes. So the big contrast with Donnelly's work is that whilst Donnelly's work is very biblical, it draws on biblical ideas. This game doesn't really have those kind of biblical overtones. It draws more on science fiction tropes. But the underlying idea of Atlantis has some sort of origin that can be traced back to Donnelly. So the second example I want to talk about is the other game called Tomb Raider Revelation. The Last Revelation, and the narrative of this is a standalone narrative. It's not tied in or connected to the Atlantis narrative. And the difference here is that the places that Lara visits are actually, they are real places in Egypt. So she starts out by going to the Valley of the Kings, which is a real place in Luxor. There she discovers a fictional tomb belonging to the god Seth. She's looking for an object known as the Ankh, as you can even see an image of it here, and she finds this object inside the tomb of Seth. It's embedded in a sarcophagus, and as she removes it, she finds that it's the sarcophagus of Seth, and she has now released Seth. So this Ankh is called, she learns that this Ankh is actually called the Amulet of Horus. So she is seeking this because she's a treasure hunter. So she's just looking for a bit of treasure, but then she finds that she has unwittingly set the apocalypse in motion. So she needs to set out to put this right and end the sort of curse, as she triggered a kind of curse by removing the Ankh. So she only reads this inscription once she has exited the tomb of Seth. Now, as an Egyptologist, I can tell you this is just a nonsense inscription. So that is not a real text. But in the context of the game, the text tells us that essentially the text is a kind of prophecy by a priest named Semiket. So that's what I mean, that by removing the Ankh, Lara essentially triggers some kind of curse which can set the apocalypse in motion. So if we have a look at this, let's look at this prophecy of Semiket. So you can see Semiket, he's depicted like this in the game. He's got some sort of armor, golden armor thing going on. So the inscription on the Ankh, it reads, I, Semiket, High Priest of Horus, forewarn that he who removes the amulet shall have released Set. And then he goes on to tell us, he shall once again violate the earth. Set is also referred to as the ruler of evil, and that he will be free at the turn of a distant millennia. And of course, the game is set in 1999, so it's just about to be the turn of a new millennium. And we're also told that there will be plagues and locusts and failed harvests, and that the heavens will split asunder, and that Horus will have to banish the Lord of Darkness, Set. So this is essentially a very biblical kind of prophecy. It's got some very distinct biblical overtones here in the sort of phrases it uses. So Lara learns from this that this is pretty serious. So she sets out to visit a friend of hers who's an archaeologist who happens to have in his possession an ancient scroll written in Hebrew. We can see here the scroll. The Hebrew has a picture of or drawing of Set on it, and it's another part of the prophecy of Semiket, quite luckily. So the second part of this prophecy says, he who removes this Hebrew prophecy, so that it says, he who removes the amulet shall once again release the dark power of Set. And then we have a bit of a quote from Set, which is, I am the shadow across the sun. I am the bringer of plagues. My wrath will consume all lands and shall be ceaseless. And then we are once again told that it has to be Horus who will banish and defeat Set. And then we are told the power to summon Horus will be revealed to the one who has the Ankh, the amulet, inside Semiket's tomb in the Karnak temple. So that's the next place that Lara goes to. So Karnak and the Valley of the Kings, they are both real places. So Karnak is a big temple complex in Luxor, dedicated to the god of moon. And in this game universe, it's also the burial site of this mysterious priest Semiket who has written this prophecy. It's never made very obvious in the game why this text is written in Hebrew, but I think it gives it a very strong, authoritative biblical overtone. I think that is the purpose. And once she finds the tomb of Semiket, she finds another piece of the prophecy, and this is read in the words of Semiket himself, and he tells us, I have served the god of light, Horus, at the time of plagues. And he goes on to say, to read this inscription, the ruler of darkness is free and Set is released. He who removes the amulet and releases the dark power of Set shall summon the sun god. So that is Horus, and only the power of the light will imprison him, so imprison Set. Then we're also told that the Horus has to be summoned through the light of the millennial constellations, but not in Luxor. This has to take place quite specifically underneath the Great Pyramid, which is at Giza in Cairo. So this is quite far away from Luxor. And then we are told that with the amulet, so that's the Ankh, with the amulet and his armor, Horus will be able to defeat Set. So this is an entirely fictional prophecy that has been invented for the purpose of this game. There is no such prophecy in real life. There is no such text. Even the concept of prophecy doesn't quite make sense in an ancient Egyptian religious concept. So this is a very biblical concept. And when it comes to this mysterious armor, so here you can see an image of the cult statue of Horus wearing this armor underneath the Great Pyramid. So the prophecy tells us that Lara has to retrieve pieces of this armor of Horus. And after she's done that, she has to put them on, all the pieces need to be put on the statue of Horus underneath the Great Pyramid. And then in order to do that, she has to travel to Alexandria, because in the context of the game, it turns out that it was the Ptolemaic dynasty, so that includes Cleopatra VII. They were the final ones to have the armor in their possession, so they hid it in their palace in Alexandria. So she has to go there and she has to explore these coastal ruins, and then she finds the entrance to the palace of Cleopatra VII, where she finds the pieces of the armor. And as it turns out, the palace is in very good condition. Despite being so old, everything seems to be working the way it should. Fountains are working and everything. It seems to be protected by some kind of magic. And we see these flesh-eating scarabs, which is another one of these cinematic tropes of ancient Egypt. So flesh-eating scarabs. We also see reanimated skeletons guarding the place. And we also see these fire-shooting birds. So a lot of mysterious magical stuff happening inside this palace of Cleopatra. So here you can see a screenshot from the palace of Cleopatra. And so you can see the fountain is working perfectly well, even after 2,000 years. If you have an Egyptologist eye, you'll also notice that the picture, that colored painting that you can sort of see through that window, is not from that period at all, because that is actually an image of Tutankhamun, who lived 1,300 years before Cleopatra. And these cartouches on the wall are from the 12th dynasty, so that's 2,000 years before Cleopatra. So all of these different objects are pretty random. But in the minds of the audience, this establishes once again that we are in Egypt, because this imagery is quite distinctly Egyptian. So it makes it very clear that this is an Egyptian place. So again, these cartouches and these images, they are not intended to date any of the objects. They are not supposed to be some sort of scholarly assessment of chronology, but they are simply meant to be a reminder to the audience that they are in Egypt. And the other thing that happens as well is that, of course, we have this quest for the armor as driving the plot, because only the armor can prevent this apocalypse where Seth becomes some kind of ruler on Earth. And this is, of course, very Judeo-Christian. This whole concept of apocalypse and the concept of revelation and prophecy, this is all very biblical, very Judeo-Christian. And it's quite clear from this that the myth of Horus and Seth is, in this game, filtered through this biblical Judeo-Christian lens for the benefit of the audience. There is also a bit of a good versus evil theme going on here, because Lara, as the hero protagonist, of course, she represents the good, because she's trying to stop the apocalypse. And then we have an adversary in the game, so you can see him here. And he is a self-proclaimed adventurer archaeologist. His name is Werner von Croy, and he's quite greedy. He's unscrupulous. He's not a very nice person. And because he's not very nice, he ends up being possessed by Seth. And so he starts to scheme to stop Lara from completing this heroic quest of finding the armor and ending the curse. So essentially this quest of finding the armor and ending the apocalypse is very much a case of good versus evil. So that's a very big overarching theme in this narrative. So Horus and Lara represent the good, and Seth and von Croy represent the evil. So at the end of the narrative, of course, because Lara is the protagonist, the hero archaeologist, she of course has to succeed in her mission. So she ends up finding this temple underneath the pyramid where Horus, the Horus statue is located. She puts the armor on it. And once she does that, she finds that Seth actually manifests in the flesh. And then she has to try to escape from the pyramid before Seth can kill her. And she ends up then sealing the temple entrance with the same ankh, the same amulet of Horus that actually triggered the curse or the release of Seth in the first place. So this stops the apocalypse, and it also ends von Croy's possession, and it re-imprisons Seth. So there is no on-screen battle between Horus and Seth, but we can infer that Seth has sent his light, his celestial light, in order to entomb or imprison Seth. So at the very end of the game, we see that Lara is trying to come out of the pyramid. The whole thing starts to collapse. And as von Croy is watching, he does attempt to help her, but he's too late and she ends up trapped inside the Great Pyramid. So that's how the game ends. And it's not clear until the next game whether she survived or not. I mean, she did, but it wasn't clear to the audience at the time whether she did or not. So there is this idea that sort of treasure hunting / archaeology is a very dangerous pursuit. That's a bit of an underlying message. So when it comes to Seth, he features, of course, quite heavily in this narrative. So let's think about what is he? So in the game, he's portrayed as some sort of demon or devil type of creature or entity. This is how he's depicted in the game. So he is depicted with the traditional Egyptian Seth animal head. He looks a bit like a canine, but it's probably meant to be a fictional animal. So this is the Seth animal. So he's depicted like that in the game, and this is how he is depicted in ancient Egyptian iconography as well. In the Egyptian religion, Seth is the son of the earth god Geb and the sky goddess Nut. He's also the brother of Osiris and the brother of Isis and Nephthys as well. He features quite heavily in the so-called Osirian myth cycle, which you know from Egyptian funerary texts like the coffin texts and the Book of the Dead. But we have the most complete version from a Greek work called, it's from Plutarch's Moralia, and it's often called the Isida et Osirida. So it's Plutarch's on Isis and Osiris. So that's the 1st century, possibly early 2nd century AD Greek work. So that's the most complete version of the myth that we have. So according to this myth, Seth was probably jealous of his brother Osiris because he was the king of Egypt. And so he decided to murder Osiris, and he divided the body into pieces and he scattered them. And then he stole the throne from Osiris. So in this myth, Isis, the wife of Osiris, had to go and find all the different pieces and reassemble the body so she could resurrect Osiris with her magic. And after this happened, he became the ruler of the underworld. And they had a son called Horus. And in this myth cycle, Horus grew up to defeat Seth. So this part of the myth is mirrored by is adopted and adapted by the game. So we have, for example, an Egyptian literary text from about 1200 BC. It's often called in English the Contendings of Horus and Seth, and it deals with this conflict between the two. And Egyptian texts, including that one, tend to really emphasize how strong Seth is. He's seen as a god who's very strong and very ferocious, and once he's defeated by Horus, he's not killed or imprisoned or anything like that. He's assigned to the front of the sun god's boat so that he can protect the sun god on his daily journey across the sky. So you can see in this image here from a papyrus, you can see Seth at the front of the sun disk boat, the sun god's boat. The sun god is sitting behind him, and Seth is spearing Apep, who's the cosmic serpent enemy of the sun god. So Seth is not seen in the Egyptian tradition as what we would call evil in a Judeo-Christian sense. He's not anything like a devil or a demon. He's instead seen as a very strong deity, very ferocious deity, and his powers have the ability to be destructive. But on the other hand, there was no taboo on people worshipping Seth. Seth was actually fairly widely worshipped, as were the other gods. And he even had a cult center in the Nile Delta. So any idea that Seth is some sort of evil demon or anything like that is a very anachronistic concept, and it's filtered through a Judeo-Christian perspective, and it's not a feature of the Egyptian religion. So that is the way in which the game changes how Seth is or what he is. So to summarize a little bit, I want to summarize some of these tropes of ancient Egypt that we find in both of these games. So when it comes to The Last Revelation, the game came out in 1999, it's set in 1999. So it very clearly mixes all of these contemporary fears around the year 2000. People at the time are very concerned with what would happen when it becomes the year 2000. That was a big cultural thing at the time. And of course, in addition to that, we have Christian notions of prophecies and the end times. So the game is mixing the Egyptian with these more modern and Christian concerns. So Lara Croft is shown as depicting not in scientific archaeology, but in treasure hunting. And treasure hunting is presented as a very risky, inherently risky pursuit. Only those with very specialist skills and knowledge can undertake this activity. And the hero archaeologist must navigate this supernatural world using their special skills to do so. We see as well that all of these ancient places, they are filled with dangerous traps, which draws on this notion of ancient advanced technology. Certain objects are treated as important. They are seen as valuable in themselves. So this is the technical term for this is a MacGuffin. So they act as these MacGuffins. They drive the plot, and discovering these objects, that's seen as a sort of end goal in itself. So it's a certain object such as the Ankh, they are and the Skion, they are seen as being inherently important, and they are not seen as being important from a scientific perspective. They are just seen as important because of some kind of magic or something like that. So for example, the Ankh in the last revelation, there is no attempt to try to explain its origin. The only thing we find out is that it was made to imprison Seth. We are never told when this happened. There's no attempt to establish a kind of chronology for any of this. It's the same with the Skion. And there isn't really any purpose, there isn't any attempt to explain the cultural purpose or significance of these objects. They are just seen as somehow important. We also see mummies as well in both games. There's a lot of mummies in both of them, and this of course draws on very modern fascination with Egyptian mummies. In modern media, we tend to see mummies presented as they are dangerous. They are also seen as somehow alive through some kind of magical means. Of course, they can also act as guardians of sacred objects and sacred places, and they can also act as agents of curses. So mummies they feature quite heavily in popular culture dealing with Egypt. And of course, the whole concept of an Egyptian curse influences the plot, especially in the last revelation, because according to this game narrative, both objects and places can be cursed. And when it comes to the Skion doesn't seem to work in the first game as something triggering a curse as such, but it is clear that it is a very dangerous object. It's an example of this advanced, almost timeless, mystical Atlantean technology, and ordinary humans can't handle these objects, and that's why the hero archaeologist, like Lara, has to do so. Otherwise, the object might fall into the wrong hands. The Ankh, or the Amulet of Horus in the last revelation, functions as a trigger for some kind of curse, and the release of Seth acts as a type of curse. And so Lara must therefore go on a quest to end the curse. And so the Ankh works as the MacGuffin that started the curse, but it's also the thing that has to end the curse as well. So both of these games, they portray Egypt as a very timeless, mystical, mysterious place of pretty much unknowable origin. And this kind of thinking about Egypt is drawn from this Orientalist way of thinking, where you have the familiar West, and then you have the strange and exotic East. So this is a very Orientalist trope. And these notions of an exotic and mystical Egypt can be traced back to ancient Greek and Roman authors. So this is not really a new concept. And finally, the biblical framework, especially in the last revelation, it seems clear that the biblical framework is a way of making the narrative more comprehensible and more meaningful to a modern Western audience. So what we're seeing here is not necessarily a representation of the ancient myth, but it's an adaptation of the ancient myth where it's been reworked to become meaningful in a more contemporary context. So that's the end of my talk. Thank you.
Thank you very much indeed, Maiken. That was very interesting.